Welcome to Behind the Bar for June 27th, 2025. Diddy's defense had the floor today for the closing arguments. Mark Agnifilo for the defense simply said this case comes down to money. It is all about money. He pointed out that Cassie received $20 million settlement and another $10 million from the Intercontinental Hotel. In essence, and actually directly, verbatim, he called Cassie the winner. He said she profited financially while Diddy sits in jail. He called this a modern-day love story, describing the consensual interactions between Diddy and Cassie. Derek, you have, throughout the day, been pretty adamant that you think Agnifilo, although brilliant in his own right and a fantastic presenter, has gone way too far.
Yeah, look, I think he's an incredible lawyer, and what I anticipated was a different style in the closing argument than what he actually delivered, because he really went for an overarching theme. You know, the prosecutors had the theme of Diddy is a kingpin. He was not to be told no. Everyone did his bidding for him, and he's a monster who should not be loose on the streets. Agnifilo has painted a picture of the prosecutors overreaching and dipping into Diddy's bedroom in order to take down a successful black entrepreneur. He played that race card for the first time I've really seen in this trial.
At least overtly.
At least so overtly.
Simmering below the surface a little bit, but now he called it out for what he believes it is.
He called it out. He said this is, they couldn't find anything real about his businesses, and instead they went into the bedroom and are basically freak-shaming Diddy and trying to trump up these charges. As you said, they really focused on money. And in my mind, that could backfire because they have painted Cassie as a profiteer, essentially, coming out ahead by settling her civil lawsuit that started this whole thing back in 2023. She filed those horrific allegations, a lot of which has been seen in the criminal trial about Kid Cudi's car being arsoned, her being sex trafficked. She withdrew that suit very shortly thereafter and settled with Diddy for $20 million, which he's made a lot of hay over. She then settled with the hotel for the $10 million. And he says she's out there with $30 million in her bank account while he is fighting for his life in jail. That is sort of the height of saying that she's a money grubber and not a real victim, and he's out here fighting to stay a free man. It really is sort of centering Diddy as a victim.
You often see this from criminal defendants where they will argue that the prosecutor's main witness is doing that because they're out for money. The difficulty that I see here, she certainly got $30 million. That's unavoidable, and that's something that the prosecution has tried to deal with from the beginning. But the difficulty I see here is that money is hers no matter what.
Yes.
No matter what she testifies to in this trial, that
not going
money
anywhere.
is long ago paid, and it's in her bank account or spent or whatever it is. That money's hers. She's not getting anything more from testifying. There's nothing for her to gain by testifying against him. It is purely because she's been called to testify and she believes that he did her wrong. The second point is that
Agnifilo would say, no, she has a vindictive end to bury him at this point.
She has a vindictive end, but although, why would she be so vindictive if not that she felt traumatized by him? But that is what it is. But the other point here is that it's not just her. Nothing that she is testifying to is really in dispute, except maybe what was in her head at any one time. But the video is the video. No matter, it's not. It's one thing if it's about money when you're saying this person's testifying to try and create a case they're going to use in a civil action against me. The video is the video. The testimony from everybody around her. She engaged in the freak-offs. She doesn't deny that she engaged, nor does the prosecution deny that at some points she expressed consent. But it is also unimpeachably true that at some points she expressed reservations about it.
That's right. And Agnifilo's not running away from the hotel video. He says it's a horrific instance of domestic violence that my client is not on trial for. He says that would be a state crime. It is not what this trial is about. This is about sex trafficking, and Cassie was never sex trafficked because you saw how enthusiastic she was about freak-offs. He even said during his closing arguments that the infamous incident involving urination, he said Cassie wanted to be urinated on. Now, on rebuttal, as we're talking about this, the prosecution has stood up again and said, basically, how dare you?
Yes.
This woman suffered such extreme trauma, and by the way, testified, so the prosecutors can point to Cassie's testimony about this settlement where she said, I would give it all up to not have gone through what I went through, and I suffered serious trauma, and the $20 million.
That's easy for her to say. She has the money.
It is easy to say, but they can at least point to her
Yeah.
tearful testimony and remind the jurors that this woman did say she would prefer to not have the money and have not been sex trafficked as she thinks she was a victim. The other thing is, I think his closing argument, Agnifalo's, was quite persuasive on Jane's testimony, where he said he had a zinger of a line. This is a very effective lawyer, and the theatrics during the closing have been on point, and I think they're landing with the jury from what we're hearing. He said Jane testified to all of these awful things, and then she left her testimony and went back to her apartment that Diddy pays for. Now, how do you think that lands? Do you think the fact that Diddy is still paying for the apartment that Jane, the woman who testified under the pseudonym, still lives in, cuts in favor of her credibility or against her credibility? To me, it cuts in favor of her credibility about the awful things, but...
Yeah, so you think it's cuts in favor because he's paying out of a sense of guilt or desire to make things right because he has guilt.
And she has the risk of losing it by saying these things.
I don't think it has. I don't think it goes necessarily either way in her credibility. I think her credibility is what it is. I don't think anybody really thinks she's lying up there. The question is whether or not the conduct that we've heard is illegal or not. Agnifalo and the defense wants to frame it as two consenting adults engaged in a transactional, relationship where she has sex and in exchange this freaky sex, and in exchange for which she gets all this stuff. Now, he's not on trial for prostitution, so that's out. Instead, what he's on trial for is coercing her, cajoling her, forcing her. And if she's going back to his apartment that she seems to enjoy, that seems to maybe suggest that it's not against her will, that she's not being cajoled, that she's not being forced or coerced.
Right, that she is still sort of in some sort of ongoing consensual relationship involving payment of her apartment. Now, so it's a complicated issue.
And that's why the jury instruction that the prosecution fought for was so important, that any one act of sex trafficking is enough. You don't have to show that Cassie or Jane are always the victims of sex trafficking. You have to show that it happened to either of them at least once. So are there moments where they willingly participated in these activities? Absolutely. Did they do it most of the time? Maybe so. Did they do it every time? Were there times when Cassie, for example, when she testified that Diddy showed her the video of her having a freak off and said, I'm going to show this to your family unless you engage in additional freak offs. And she said, I didn't want to, and I did because of that threat. Was that one time an act of sex trafficking? And it seems probably is.
Yeah. And
that gives the jury enough to hang their hat on.
That's exactly right. They just have to get one of these instances to land. Jane had a testimony about being beaten.
Physically
beaten at his, I believe, his Miami compound. And then at the end of it, him saying, you know what you need to do now? We need to do a freak off. And he called an escort over when she had just endured what she described as sort of a savage beating, running around the house, him trying to break down doors. This sounds like the kind of force.
That credibility, to your point about credibility, and I had sort of pushed that aside, but that's really important there, because if you believe that testimony, if you believe that she suffered a brutal beating at his hands, at which point he said, you know what, to make up for your conduct, we're going to have a freak off right now, and she testified, I didn't want to, and I did. If you believe that, you can't acquit. You really can't.
Yeah.
You're going to follow the law.
Yeah, and look, I think Agnifalo is playing the hand that was dealt to him. He is taking the appropriate shots. I think he went a little too far with Cassie, but he's also pointing to those raids where he says, all you guys heard about was how much baby oil and Astroglide they found, and he's sort of clowning it as, good thing we got those off the street, and the 5 Valium pills that they found because this guy had a drug habit. He's sort of painting this as overreach and saying, this is a guy who had an active sexual life. He's a hugely successful guy, and all you hear about is how much baby oil he had. I thought that's fairly effective, although that's not the prosecution's case.
Yeah.
The case is not really about baby oil. That is just a piece of color commentary that has been in the media.
But what do you think about this general idea, right? We've talked a lot about atmospherics, about how the general feeling of the jury is the prosecution did an effective job in their case of painting him as a monster. Have they done an effective job in their defense? Has the defense done an effective job of saying, well, let's back off of that a little bit and look at it with a little sort of more jaundiced eye at the prosecution's case. Was he really a monster, or was he just a freak? And they were willing participants in these weird sexual escapades. And, forget about the picayune little legal issues. Do you really see somebody who was a monster, or do you see a group of people who just really enjoyed a different deviant kind of sex.
Yeah, without it being televised, and even when it's televised, you don't see how these things land with the jury.
Yeah.
But my impression has been they have painted effectively, the prosecutors have painted him effectively as a dangerous person. And it's not so much about Cassie and Jane for me. What it is more the assistants who testify, Christina Coram, who testified about being taken and whisked away to an abandoned warehouse, tied up to a lie detector because she was accused of stealing some jewelry for 5 days, and was sort of taken back and forth for 5 days and subjected to this sort of torment. That really lands with me, that this is a man who's incorrigible when he has money and power to throw around. He abuses it.
Yes.
That has landed with me. A lot of people in this office and outside have framed the RICO charges as the weakest. They've said, this is not a criminal enterprise. It's a head of Bad Boy Records who like to do some freaky stuff on the side. I actually find the RICO stuff quite compelling. I find he's not just a jealous ex-boyfriend. He's a guy who can order people to firebomb cars, and that scares me. So he does seem to be the type of guy who could do more harm in the world if he's freed by the jury. How does that land with you?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's not just the firebombing cars. I mean, that's the biggest one because we all know Kid Cudi and we all heard that story. We reported on that story years ago. You have the firebombing of cars. You have the bringing the weapons to a confrontation with Suge Knight. You have the arranging for drugs, whether the Valium or Vicodin, but we also heard about cocaine and other drugs being brought to the freak-offs, being disseminated, distributed to people. You also have the extortion attempts at Cassie to get her engaged in the freak-off. If you put all of these things together, this is really a classic case of a RICO case. You have certainly multiple people involved in the conspiracy. You have him as a kingpin. I know I keep going back. I said it over and over again to the Tony Soprano being the archetype of what we consider a RICO perpetrator of RICO. Other than the fact that one was in an Italian mafioso style, and this is sort of like a music mogul with women. It's hard to find the daylight between those two types of conduct. And therefore, I fall on the side that you do of Diddy was a racketeer. He was the head of a criminal enterprise. He was the head of an enterprise that engaged in all kinds of crimes.
The other thing I want to say is Agnifalo's done a good job of waving his hand at these incidents and saying that's not really his style. He would have confronted Kid Cudi. He's not a guy who firebombs cars. I don't really buy that for a second, and I'm not sure a jury will buy that. The other thing I want to say is racketeering. I think they've laid the predicate that some of these criminal things happen, the extortionate attempts, the kidnapping, the arson. It doesn't mean that Diddy was always monstrous. Just as Tony Soprano had a capacity for charm, these guys have capacity to be incredibly generous at times. I'm sure Diddy has done wonderful things. I'm sure he's donated to charities that I care deeply about. He's been in plays.
He probably loved Cassie at a certain level. I think he did love her.
I think he absolutely loved her. And I think he was also monstrous towards her. And what he's on trial for are the monstrous activities. It doesn't negate the fact that as a fully formed human, he did a lot of great in this world, made a lot of good music. He's still a monster in my mind.
Maybe trials are necessarily reductive, but to have to even say the words just because he was nice to her sometimes doesn't mean he didn't commit crimes. I mean, we are all aware, either firsthand or secondhand, of abusive husband-wife relationships where he loves her and adores her and she loves and adores him, and most of the time they're fine, but sometimes he drinks too much and beats the shit out of her.
Right.
Do we ever say, well, let's not convict him because most of the time he's nice to her?
Yeah.
And that's sort of like, I mean, just to, again, reduce it down to its sort of most base level, that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're talking about a guy that most of the time was quite kind. Most of the time was very charitable. Most of the time was great to his employees. Lots of people say wonderful things about him. And certainly all the time he was quite charming. But sometimes he would beat the shit out of people. Sometimes he would bring in escorts and force women to have sex, not force them at gunpoint, but force them through threats to their career, threats of exploiting them or showing their worst moments to their friends and family. Those are crimes.
Yes, and created a cumulative sense that they were scared. They were scared that and felt trapped that they couldn't leave his clutches in some way. And I think the prosecution has made an effective case of that. Agnifalo called this a modern-day love story with Cassie. I think that kind of rhetoric overreaches. And so that's how it landed with me. We will see. Now, the rebuttal will be done. The jury is going to be charged on Monday.
Yeah, talk through the time. We're going to go to comments in just a second, Tony, if we can get those up pretty soon. But I think talk us through the timeline. What do you expect to happen over the next few days? It's Friday afternoon as we're recording.
That's right. It's Friday. It is late on the East Coast. They're finishing up the rebuttal, and that will be it. But there's not going to be enough time, apparently, to charge the jury. So the instructions have been set, but Judge Subramanian said he's going to bring in the jury on Monday. He's going to instruct them. That will probably take an hour, maybe 2 hours at the outset. Then he's going to send them off to deliberate. And deliberations will begin on Monday. That jury will be locked in a room. They will take straw polls. They will discuss the evidence. They will sort of see where they are and try to come to a verdict as quickly as possible. We've discussed how the 4th of July holiday is going to impact
the 3rd of July is actually a federal holiday,
That's right.
It's closed. So that's Thursday. And the judge has suggested, as is his right, that he might hold court open on Thursday for continued deliberations. I don't really feel that that's a true threat. I think he's saying that in order to get the jury to really lock in and try to resolve it by Wednesday. If I can see if they come back and there's conversations in the judge and the jury, they will come out and ask questions and want to hear additional testimony. If he gets the sense they're quite close, if they inform him that they're done, that they've reached a verdict on 2 of the 3 counts, he might send them back just for a partial day on Thursday to try to see if they can resolve it. But my guess is we're going to have deliberations through Wednesday. If we don't have a verdict by then, he will hold it over until next Monday.
Yeah, I actually have some belief that they will get a verdict by Wednesday. It is a hugely complicated case. It's very long. There's lots of evidence, but I do feel like the jury has their impressions. This has been a very thorough discussion of the evidence for many, many weeks. Probably they want to get on with their lives. I can imagine they've formed their impressions. It's not that complicated. This isn't financial fraud. This is, do you believe this testimony of all these people amounted to a crime? So I think there's a chance of a quick verdict. If it's quick, I believe it will be guilty.
Oh, without question. Yeah. Without question. If you've seen the first 4 or 5 hours, it's guilt. Teddy Bear asks, if Diddy walks away a free man, what charges will be next, if any? No criminal charges, but Diddy still has, 100 civil lawsuits?
Yeah, Tony Busby has said he represents around 100 alleged victims in all of these civil suits that are filed.
Dozens have been filed already.
Oh, a couple more were filed yesterday. We covered 2 more yesterday.
It's so routine, I don't even know when they're happening.
They are so routine. He still has to face all of that, but criminally, he will be cleared. If he is found not guilty, you can't recharge him. That's double jeopardy, and that will be that. Bezo Lego says, do you think the jury being tired will influence their decision? I do. These are humans.
Well, they want to get it done more quickly. They want to be done before the 4th of July, I think.
That's human nature. I know that this man's life hangs in the balance. I do hope they discharge their duties responsibly, and I think they do. I think juries tend to think, we have an important task here, and let's do so responsibly, but it's going to factor in that they want to move on with their lives.
SAS 1000, how do NDAs, hush money, or confidential settlements interfere with investigations or trials? Typically, they don't. Those kinds of things are tossed aside when it comes to evidence, especially in a high-profile criminal, particularly in a criminal trial where the evidence is essential to the determination of guilt or innocence. Civil cases, they can sometimes be excluded depending on the issues.
But if you're subpoenaed to testify, you're subpoenaed to testify.
That's right.
And that is a penalty if you don't come in and testify.
NDAs are extremely common, and most of the time they are for very good purposes. Two businesses are coming together and they have to exchange trade secrets to see if they want to do work together. NDAs are a common practice. We have them around here. It's something that I draft once in a while. Most NDAs have a clause in there that this is not, this NDA ensures confidentiality except in the case of a lawfully issued subpoena.
That's right. Ridmai says, how many people they need for a mistrial and how do you get an acquittal? So that's a good question. An acquittal.
One person's
that's
mistrial.
Right. One for a mistrial. If it is a hopelessly deadlocked jury, which just means we can't all get on the same page about guilt or not guilty on a particular charge, that is called a hung jury, and they have to try very, very hard to be deadlocked and not be able to come to a verdict. Acquittal is all of them saying not guilty. That's as hard as getting guilt in some sense because you have to get everyone on the same page that he should walk free.
Now, at the end of it, if there is a hung jury, the lawyers will have the right to poll the jury to see how many people were not voting for guilt or how many, what the breakdown of the 12-person vote was. If they find out, if the prosecution finds out that most people were guilty or voted for guilt, but there were 1 or 2 holdouts, my guess is they're going to retry them again. If they find out the other way, that it was sort of 11-1 or 10-1, 10-2 the other way,
they may not.
They may not. They may say, especially if they get convictions of on the lesser charges, and he's going to do a little bit of time, they may back away from it. But I think there'll be a lot of political pressure for the prosecution to retry him in the case of mistrial. By the way, there's no double jeopardy, right? We know about double jeopardy. Can't be tried for the same case twice. A mistrial, it's as if the first time never happened. You start over from scratch with jury selection, and you go through the whole thing.
People know this. That's what happened with Karen Reed. She had a mistrial, and then they had an acquittal. Let's go to some comments, or let's go to Danielle Franzi says, when is sentencing? I don't know the exact timing of sentencing.
Whenever the judge has time on his calendar,
the judge will
3 or 4 weeks out.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. There'll be different motions about how harshly they should sentence him.
Yeah, that's true. It could be actually a lot of motion practice here. You may be talking about a few months. Diddy, assuming he's convicted of a crime, he will be kept in prison until sentence.
That's exactly right. And one more comment, we'll say Grazino, prosecution has examples of every charge, only need one of each. True, except for the RICO charge, they need to prove 2 of those predicate acts.
That's what the law says.
The law says in order to have an enterprise, you can't just pin it on one illegal act. But remember, one of those predicate acts is the Mann Act. It's illegal to, one of the predicate offenses would be just transporting prostitutes, which is a pretty strong case for them. And then they can go for the kidnapping, arson, extortion, all those drug distribution.
Here's where I think the tail wags the dog a little bit, because if the jury wants to convict him of RICO, there are plenty of predicate acts to convict him on.
Yeah.
So if they don't want to convict him on RICO, that's okay too. But if they want to, we don't have to worry about.
Prosecution has given them a lot of avenues.
The picky unit analyses of which might constitute a predicate act or not. It's whether or not they want to do it, and then they'll be able to do it. Plenty of evidence.
And one more thing about that, they're not going to have to, on the jury verdict form, say, we believe he bombed Kid Cudi's car. They're just going to say guilty on RICO. Yeah. And
right.
Their finding it necessarily involves that they found 2 predicate acts. So it's not going to be that specific in the verdict.
All right, guys. It's pretty exciting, Derek. We've been doing this since May the 5th, right? That's when the first day of trial was, and we are finally closing arguments are now over. On Monday, the jury would deliberate. I expect within 24, 48 hours of Monday's deliberation, we will have a answer to the question, is Diddy found guilty or not of the crimes for which he's been accused?
Yeah, what a trial.
See you guys soon.